stuff, but just a little bit.
This is John from RVA Katana in Richmond, Virginia. We're going to start up in a second. We are talking about 1,000 years of change in the Japanese sword. Now, the Japanese sword has undergone a lot of change over the years just because of battlefield tactics and materials available. And our guest today is Matt Jarrell. He is in the Central Virginia area, probably one of the most experienced Japanese sword collectors. And so he's visiting us from Charlottesville. And we have a standing room only thing, literally because we don't have chairs. So anyway, well, we have a few chairs. So
I'm not from here anymore, but
anyway, we will get this started. Matt is introducing himself to people, but we will start. And this is once again RVA Katana in Richmond, Virginia, and we are going to be talking about antique Japanese swords. These are anywhere from about 1,000 years old and on.
I'm a fan of when I started collecting, I was into Yamato, the Warrior Monks.
So here we are. Steve wants us to do a close-up, and we'll do a close-up going back in time. And in a moment, we will start. This is the Koto table. All these swords are at least 400 years old. Coming up to this last one, which is about 1,000 years old. This is Koshirae, basically antique Japanese fittings, including some punto. But we'll talk about this as we go. We have a Naginata right there. All right. That one's a railway seal. That's a railway steel one too. So, okay. I'm going to try not to walk into stabby tips here. But thank you all for coming in today. This is Matt Jarrell. He is probably one of the more experienced collectors of antique Japanese swords in the area. And he has brought several of the swords from his collection here. And he's going to tell us a little bit about how the Japanese sword has changed over time. The shape of it has changed over time. This is sort of the beginning when you're trying to evaluate a Japanese sword, trying to say, who made this, what time period. The first thing you look at is shape. So I'll take it over, or rather Matt will take it over.
Great, awesome, thank you. It was nice to meet all of you. Thank you very much for coming out. Excited to be here to share a little bit about what I've learned about Japanese samurai swords. So I'm Matt Jarrell. I am a collector, buyer, an occasional seller of Japanese swords, frequent trader, sometimes seller. But I'm very passionate about Japanese swords, and I'm in my second decade of studying these swords. And for me, it's been mostly a study. I'll say a growth step for me will be when I'm actually practicing. I just have a couple of young kids, and so buying and selling is about all I have time to do. But I'm very passionate about the hobby. I'm excited to be here, and I hope I can share something with you that you help you kind of advance your knowledge on Japanese swords. For me, though, it's been primarily a study, and it's been a very fascinating field to study. So, Japanese sword, it's amazing how they even ended up in the U.S. It's not really a native item to the U.S., but somehow we got lucky and ended up with many, many swords after World War II. A lot of them have been kind of surfaced and gone back to Japan, and now they're coming back out of Japan. They ping-pong around. Collectors all over the world collect these items. But what I found really fascinating about them for me was the depth of history in these items. So I got really lucky. I was living in Richmond. This was probably about 2008 time frame, and I used to live on Boulevard, right at Boulevard and Cary. And around that time, I was going to gun shows in the area, and found a sword in Fredericksburg. And the sword, I had a couple of military swords, and so I knew the military swords. I'd seen them in gun shows growing up. I wasn't really a collector at that point. I was being an idiot, really. And I got lucky. I just got lucky and just fell into this thing. But I got a sword, and I got it home. I paid a good price for it. I got it home, and I even took the handle off, and there were some characters on the tank, Nakigo. And when I translated the characters, I realized the sword was made in the 1600s. That, for me, was just like, whoa! This thing is 200 years older than the United States. How in the hell am I in my little apartment in Richmond, Virginia, holding a 400-year-old item? It made no sense to me. But that's what got me into it. It's because it was just crazy. It made no sense. And so I was like, there must be something cool at the end of that trail. So I went down it. And here I am. So I'm 15, 16 years into this, but I'm very much a student. I'm on the learning curve. I'm still on the steep slope up because it's such a deep field of study. The Japanese made swords. They started making, they made swords. They originally borrowed technology from the mainland China, and they started experimenting with it because they lost in battle a couple times and started experimenting with it, and they perfected a type of swordsmithing that balanced the dynamics of making really sharp, cutting-edge weapons that could cut well, but balanced with the durability of a very fine and handcrafted and high-quality steel. And so they perfected this art of a sword, of making these swords. And so, anyway, the history goes back of them making single-edged, curved-bladed weapons. The art goes back over 1,000 years. So over 1,000 years of history making these swords, and so it's just a hugely deep field of study. And so it takes people a lifetime to learn. So I very much feel like I'm a student and I'm learning, but I hope I can share something with you that I've learned along the way. And so today, I have my notes, I'll reference them a little bit because I'm quite forgetful, but I feel like I've got everyone's names, so I'm trying to remember. For today, I want to primarily share with you what I think of as the shape of the Japanese sword. So I think I'll start here. Everyone knows something about Japanese samurai swords on some level. And if you don't, that's okay. It's fine, but it just sort of gives me a little bit of a place to start. So maybe I'll do this a couple times. I'll go back to go forward. So I talked a little bit about how far the history of sword making goes back. What I'll say is the Japanese, their culture for most of that 1,000 years was very martial, military-led, military-focused, and it was a warrior culture. The weapons of the warriors were very important to them. But obviously because it was a martial culture and they valued fighting on some level, they had a lot of fights. And so one thing that's really fascinating about their swords is that as they made swords, they adapted swords over time to the style of fighting that was prevalent. So sometimes they were fighting Mongol invaders. Most of the time they were fighting themselves. When they fought themselves, there were different types of armor, different types of circumstances, and so the weapons and the swords evolved over time to meet the style of fighting that was prevalent at that point in time. And so that's what influences the shape of the Japanese sword. And that's what I'm here mostly to share with you today is the shape of the Japanese sword. I'll talk about a couple of other little things. Really never enough time to talk about it all in one setting, but for today I mostly just want to share with you what I know about the shape of the Japanese sword and how it evolved over time. And for today we have about 800 or 900 years worth of swordsmithing here. And so it is a decent sample to see how the shape evolved over time. And we'll go from Heian, which is a period about 1150-ish, all the way to some World War II stuff that was made for World War II, 1940s. So 800 years, 800, no, give or take.
Not too
give
long.
or take 100. So that's who I am. That's what I want to share with you. I'm excited to be here. And I'll pause there. And important, as we go through this, if you have questions, please ask. Stop me and let's talk about it. Like, I really encourage a discussion, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'll say, I'll do my best. I don't know everything, but I'll share what I know and tell you what I don't. But feel free to ask questions along the way, and we can talk about these things. Any questions before we go a level deeper?
I was thinking maybe when you show each sword, let people just walk in a line or look at it and stuff, like you could hold it up or whatever, and yeah.
Yes. Oh, so
But hold your breath because Japanese swords rust very easily. Hold your breath, don't breathe on it.
I agree. So what I should say this, definitely want this to be interactive on some level. It's probably a bit much to give everyone a chance to hold everything, but I would say definitely want folks, if you're interested, please come through and inspect. I would recommend kind of when we're done coming through on this way, just because the edges are on that side.
Don't stab yourself on the tips.
That's important. My first rule of Japanese swords is don't hurt yourself. If, for instance, you were handling a sword of mine and you drop it, don't try to catch it. Just let it go. The surgery's not worth it. Now, we might not get to handle another sword, but still, the surgery's not worth it. So, yeah, if you will get a chance to kind of look at everything, what I'll do is, as I'm talking about them, I'll hold them up and sort of point out what I think is important with respect to the shape. As I'm sure most of you know, a Japanese sword has some key other appreciable features. So, in addition, the shape, well, I'll get into the shape in a minute, but the shape is a very important feature. Also, the hata, which is the surface pattern of the steel, tells us a lot about the sword. And then also one of the things that makes Japanese sword special is the hamon, the tempered edge. And that tempered edge is one of the things that really sets Japanese swords apart. Besides the curvature and the single edge, it's the hamon, tempered edge, which was the technology that they introduced that helped balance this really sharp cutting edge made of crystalline steel, backed up by more malleable and dull, non-tempered regular steel. So anyway, some rules, kind of rules of engagement. So I'll hold it up, we'll talk about it. When we're done, I want to invite everybody to look at everything. I would say as you're looking at things, please don't talk, because I'll talk and Spin will go over the blades and I'll be upset because I rustled. But I think for that to happen. So anyway.
We have masks. Do you want people to wear masks? We have masks here.
No, everyone's okay. I would just say as you're looking at them, try not to talk too much. Also, if you're coming on that side, please watch out for the edges of things. They're dangerous. And then finally, if you want to handle swords, I would say this, like on my business card, if you want to handle swords sometime in like sort of a private environment and we can handle them like in sort of a safe environment, safe way, like contact me. We can catch up some other time and show you swords. I have swords for sale, let you know to wink, but no obligation, but I'm always interested to meet local collectors and share stuff. So if you want to handle stuff and we'll look at the hamon and study them in a little bit more detail, it's definitely a possibility.
Matthew has a vault. He has a vault of, yeah, it's pretty amazing.
How much of this is your collection? How much of your collection is this? Majority of it? Half? Quarter? Would you say?
A small slice, but it's the good stuff. Of the good stuff, 50% of the good stuff. And then, and I don't want to say good stuff, I have to, I want to share nice swords. But swords come in all shapes and sizes, all values, all conditions. I have really nice swords that are rusted pieces of junk. You wouldn't pay $300 for it. But if it was restored, it could be $2,000, right? So swords like that. I have lots and lots of military swords. So I have all kinds of swords. This is just a slice. The website, the business cards has where you can go kind of look at stuff. But this is what I would say. These are all swords that have been restored for the most part on some level. Like you can see a lot of swords I have at home, like the rusted, you can't see anything. All these swords though, they've been restored. They're in pristine condition. So even glancing from here, you can see the hamon, the hada, some of the activity in the hamon. So it's all in a good state of care. So I wanted to share, good stuff so that you can see what is appreciable in Japanese swords. For pretty much rusted junk, you'd be like, what flea market did this guy come from? Even though I did come from a flea market in Alabama. So,
I bought stuff at flea markets.
yeah, there's some good stuff at flea markets. I shouldn't let that out.
I found some amazing swords at flea markets.
That stuff turned up in so many different ways. National treasures turned up at yard sales. I mean, it's mind-blowing what was in the United States for 50, 60 years.
Is the Honjo Masamune in some shed in some trailer park in Arkansas?
Yes, it
They
is.
never know.
It's out there. After this, I'll keep going. There's all kinds of sword stories we can talk about this stuff filtering up and what's come out of the ether.
And one more thing just to note is that when we talk about Japanese swords, we're talking about the steel blade. So the wooden scabbard, these are called shirasaya, meant to protect the blade. That's not what they would actually, you could not fight with them. They would split on you. So when we say a sword is 800, 500 years old, we're not talking about the wooden shirasaya, but the actual steel blade itself. Just so,
It's a great point, John. I'm glad you bring that up because I would say before we talk about the blades, let me go one step back to go forward. So first, I want to share some koshira, the mounts. The reason why is like when someone says a sword, they usually think about it's like everything together. But for our discussion, what I would recommend is I think it's always important to separate the blade from the koshira. Koshira are the mounts, the ska, the handle, the tsuba, the handguard, the saya, scabbard, koshira. Blade is just a bare blade. And it's important to separate them for a couple reasons. One, blades last hundreds of years. Koshira usually lasts 100 to 200 years at best. Koshira are made of wood primarily, cloth, some race skin. These parts get brittle, they disintegrate over time. So koshira is important to separate from the blade. The reason why is because sometimes blades are 800 years old, but they're in koshira that's only 100 or 200 years old, or koshira that was in World War II. Right? So sometimes we see a bunch of World War II blades. 9 out of 10 were made during World War II, but one of those swords contains an old Nihanto, an old Japanese sword, 400 or 500 years old. So that's why I feel it's really important to think about koshira separate from blades. So I'll introduce some Koshirae. And I'll start with just some really basic stuff that you might encounter at the flea market, right? So for Koshirae, we'll start here. This is a very typical military sword. It's a Type 95 non-commissioned officer sword. It's very easy to spot because it's mass-produced. They all look generally the same, and it has a metal handle, meant to copy the style of a real handle, a real Scott. So it's very easy to spot, but it's a military sword from World War II, mass-produced. They're collectible, but I would say maybe they're not quite as special as a 500-year-old sword. Next up, we have a Type 98 Shinguto. Of all the swords you're likely to encounter in the U.S., at flea markets, gun shows, my house, wherever, but this is like the primary one you'll see. Because there were so many of these brought back from the war, they were littered everywhere. But it's a Type 98 Shinguto. It is the classic Japanese commissioned Imperial Japanese Army officer sword. Most of these contain blades that were made in the 1930s and 40s. Some of them are really high quality. Maybe 1 in 10 though contains an older Nihonto. But you'll find this sword, it'll be in these mounts. It's a military mount. Next up, we have another military mount. This is a Kaigunto. And so this is the World War II naval officer's sword. And it's similar to the military sword, but a little different. It has a race skin saya, 2 hangers, a brown tassel, different tsuba, and they usually contain stainless steel swords because the Navy didn't want swords rusting. The Japanese swords, most of you know, are apt to rust and they're made from traditional materials. So it's a Kaigunto, naval officer sword. Sometimes they have old swords in them. This one actually contains a sword that was carried by the Chief of Naval Intelligence. He was an admiral. Next up, we have another military sword, but looks a little bit different. This is a Russo-Japanese era sword called the Kyugunto. And so in Japan, so again, I'm actually going to go from the latest stuff to the oldest stuff back to the latest stuff. But so we're starting in the 1940s, now we're headed back to the 1900s, early 1900s. But Japan, when Japan industrialized after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, they started bringing over a lot of Western military consultants to build a new military around. And at that time, they were trying to emulate what Western militaries were doing. If you have any experience with Western swords, a lot of those swords have D-guard mounts. And so what they did is they fashioned a D-guard mount for their officers to carry, but they put old samurai swords in these mostly. So a lot of times if you find swords in these mounts, like this one, this sword, the mounts are from the 1800s, but the blade is from the 1600s. It's a wakizashi from, say, 1670s. And we find a lot of times old samurai swords and Russo-Japanese warrior mounts because the samurai lost power in 1868. The market was flooded with swords. You could buy swords a dime a dozen because there was no usage for swords, right? And so they were able to they had tons of swords to put in these types of mounts. Whereas in World War II, they had a huge demand for swords. They didn't even have enough old samurai swords, so they had to start making swords again. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So, but those are military mounts. You will see and encounter lots of blades, old blades, and military mounts. But then we transition to I want to be careful about couching what I would say the good stuff. I like old Nihonto, old stuff. Some people like military stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. But my personal taste is a little bit more to old Nihonto. So here, I'll transition now, and we will go back before the Meiji Restoration to feudal Japan. And in feudal Japan, everything was custom made and handmade. No two things are alike for the most part. Military, everything was uniformly fit into the same kind of mounts. Different swords, different lengths, whatever, fit into the same mounts. But with samurai mounts, old samurai mounts, everything was custom and unique. So, for instance, here we have the Koshirae for one of the swords down here. All this Koshirae is for swords. It's that of a wakizashi from the 1600s. And you'll see it's unique. I've got a lot to talk about, so I'll move kind of quickly. But when you look at these, you'll notice that each of these Koshirae are unique and different. So this is Koshirae for one of the swords. It's a Handachi mount for a sword that we'll look at here in a second, but all custom, all handmade. This is a massive Koshirae for a really large sword down here. Katana style mounts, but all kind of custom. And then I apologize in advance. I meant to bring the blade for this, and I forgot. These are Akuchi mounts for a blade from the 1400s. Meant to be kind of worn as a side item on formal occasions. But what you'll notice is that these Koshirae, again, point one is that Koshirae, everything but the blade. And then we get into the blade. So separate blade from mounts. A lot of these blades, as John mentioned, you'll see these wooden cases. They're called shirosaya. It's just a storage case. So particularly if you were like a wealthy samurai, say 1800, you might have 3 or 4 different types of mounts. You had a mount to take to battle, you had a mount to take to spar, you had a mount to take to court. But when the blade was not in mounts, you put it in a wooden storage mount to protect the blade. And today, when we find stuff all rusted and beat up and we have it restored, once it's restored, we don't want to put it back into whatever it was in. It's all rusty and junky in there. So we have a new shirosaya made to protect the blade once it's been restored. So all these shirosaya, for the most part, have been made and are modern to protect the blade after it was restored. This sword is not restored though, and it's in an older shirosaya that's kind of busted up. It will be restored at some point. This is what an old shirosaya looks like. It has an old sayagaki or attribution. It's the one put on in the 1800s. That's what an older shirosaya was made, where a samurai had a blade for a few different types of things. So, all balls there, but that's fittings. And again, it's important to separate the fittings, the koshirai, from the blades.
You put oil on the blades to protect it?
Yes. So all these blades, except for the stainless steel blade, all the blades are made from a type of iron called tamahagane. Tamahagane is carbon steel. So when they tamahagane is the ore, it's iron ore. They pound it, refine it into steel. But that steel that comes out of the process is carbon steel, and it will rust. Japan's a very humid place. And these swords will rust if they're not properly maintained and cared for. So yes, we apply a light coat of oil on the exterior of the blades to protect it from rusting. And like every couple months, we take the blade out, we take the old oil off, we enjoy the blade for a little bit, we study it, we put new oil back on, and it goes back. All these blades still have oil on it. Kind of ran out of time. I didn't have time to take all the oil off. That's another hour, and I was running late. So you'll see like a little bit of sheen, and that's the oil on these things. Any more questions?
About how long is the restoration process?
Good question. Not as long as it used to be. And it depends on who is going to be restoring your sword. And so the highest quality restorations, you're probably looking at long waits. Like there's one restorer in the US who trained in Japan, has full apprenticeship. He's kind of really well known in the US, and his wait time's like 5 years.
Wow.
But there are in the U.S. and in the U.S. so there are other restorers in the U.S. Like you can send them a sword and probably have it back in good restorers have it back in 6 months to a year, and then you can send it to average polishers, which you don't recommend, and they'll have it back to you in like a couple weeks. But like on average, I would say right now, if you send a sword to Japan, which is where most of the restorers are, and you just want like a good restoration, right? And anything coming out of Japan will be a good restoration. A couple years, you send it. Like the lines are shorter now than they used to be. Used to you have to wait 3 years, 5 years, longer. But there's like not as much work now for restorers as there used to be. And also prices are pretty advantageous because the yen is weak. So if you send a sword to Japan now, maybe you get it back in a couple of years. Because it takes time, it's got to get there, they have to license it, has to get in line, then it takes time to restore it. A year, 2 years.
What about the actual restoration process? About how long is?
Oh, good question. That's a real good question. I don't have a great answer for it. I don't have a great answer because I'm not, so I want to suggest, I can't answer it because every restorer is different. Maybe one restorer does one sword at a time. Maybe, then probably they've got a bunch of swords and they do some on this one, some on this one, some on this one, and bouncing around. It depends on the restorer, I think. So, but if you just worked on one blade and you didn't really just focused on it, I guess about a week would be my guess.
A week to 2 weeks is what we see on average. Yeah, but they're only working on multiple blades at the same time.
Yes.
Would they ever redo a heat treat on it with the restoration?
Some can, but probably not the restorer. If they were going to they were going to apply yakigiri, like recreate a new temporal element, a sort of lost one, they'll probably go to a swordsmith for that. And I think they can do that. Some can. I'm sure it's a pretty tricky process and probably not cheap, but yes, I'm sure it can be done, but probably not a swordsmith. And there are many swordsmiths in Japan today that are making new swords. And continuing the tradition.
Do they do it with any modern techniques, or would they keep like a traditional technique?
A little bit of all of it. And so, coming out of Japan today, there are extremely high quality custom ordered swords that'll run you in the 5 figures, maybe 6 figures. And then there's lower quality swords for practitioners. And maybe the lower quality stuff There might be some other, like, they might like, probably most swords coming out of Japan use tamahagari. They're made with the traditional material. High quality ones definitely made in the traditional way of heat treating it and tempering it in water. But like a lot of smiths now, for instance, like you see like videos on swordsmiths making swords, you'll see like 4 of them hammering out the steel. But now sometimes they use like power hammers, like machine hammers to pound out the steel. So there are some ways they use modern manufacturing to kind of shortcut some of the steps. But probably if you're buying a sword 5 figures, that was probably pounded out by each of those guys. Maybe if you're buying a $500 sword, you know, I don't know what they did, but they probably took some shortcuts. Because, you know, that's how they can afford to sell it.
You're not getting a 500 sword.
Yeah.
Unless it's a zinc alloy one.
Who would do the majority of the cleaning? Would the owner of the store do their own cleaning, or would they give it to like a servant?
Good pup. This owner relies on servants. I've got, you know, all sorts of children that I'm kidding. I should say that.
There you go, Keith.
This owner cleans his own swords, but back a long time ago, I imagine most samurai probably clean their own swords. Most. Because it has to be someone who knows how to handle a sword, right? Like, it's not, you're not going to just give it to someone who doesn't know what they're doing. But they were a martial society. They had several levels of hierarchy. I'm sure a senior samurai, probably that had, you know, student samurai to do grunt work. I can't answer that for sure. Actually, I've never researched that point. But just sort of logically thinking about it, I'm sure that a senior samurai might entrust junior samurai to do grunt work. I don't know what the grunt work was, but also
Samurai intern.
they had a more or less cult of the sword. Also, an important thing, a lot of swordsmiths were actually priests, and the swords are religious items, in a sense. And they considered them as religious items. And so as a religious item, I mean, they didn't, you know, everyone's a little bit different, but for the most part, they didn't F around. Like, they took treatment of their swords and care of their swords very serious, along with many other things. So, and they had very formal, like, are you familiar with the tea ceremony?
Yes.
Like, it's a 45-minute ceremony to just make a cup of tea. And it's very ritual-esque. And I imagine taking care of swords was treated in a similar manner of great care and patience and time to not make a mistake and to do it right. And so, if you were going to let someone else do it, you'd probably pick that person with great care. That'd be my guess.
In the classical arts, we're also taught that a lot of samurai they're actually taught to actually maintain their own blade as a point of self-reflection or zazen or meditative state. So caring for your blade, they say, is polishing your heart mirror. You know, by cleaning it, taking care of it, reflecting on what you do with it or how you react to it. Believe it or not, a lot of samurai will clean their own swords and use that time as a period of self-reflection. So it has some interesting philosophical elements to that, taking care of your own sword.
That's cool. That's really cool. I have some questions for you after this. That's deep.
It's your seminar, buddy.
Yeah, no, I'm just, man, I'm a student. I'm very much learning, but that is deep. I haven't heard that before. It's very deep. Any more questions before we talk about swords, blades?
I do have just one quick question, sorry. I've noticed a lot of the more modern katanas would have on the end of the handle would have a tilt at the bottom of it.
Okay.
Is that specific to technique or?
I would say that is specific to trying to copy some of the oldest blades. So we'll talk about this in a second. But the oldest blades have a very deep curvature. It's curvature, deep curvature. And then the curvature sometimes goes into the nakago, the ten. And on the oldest swords, you see the nakago bend like that. And so whenever you find a sword in the rough, and you find that kind of nakago, like fireworks should go off, you might have a really old sword on your hands.
Well, I've seen a couple that have it been this way, and then they have it opposite on the bottom.
Going in the opposite direction. Those are
Bad.
usually like just not modern day things. They're not, yeah, they're just fun swords. Yeah, they're not traditional swords.
You see a lot of curvature at the handle because you're using one hand while riding a horse. Makes sense.
But that's actually a good segue. So let's jump in and let's talk about the blades and the curvature of the blades, which is kind of what we're here to talk about. And I would start actually with that point. So going back, so we'll talk about the shape of the Japanese sword and how it changed over time. But the kind of like earliest examples that like like there were really early examples that were very straight. We'll just sort of skip over that. We'll jump to Heian period, say about 1100s. But the earliest swords, for the most part, are long curved swords that were primarily for use by horseback. Like the samurai was mostly a mounted archer. Like they don't even want to get in a sword fight. They'd rather shoot you with an arrow. And swords, I mean, for lack of a better way to put it, were kind of commonly used for like mowing down fleeing villagers, right? They were for use from horseback or pitched battles from horseback. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm just trying to like kind of state the fact of like they were for use from horse. So the early swords, they are long and curved. They have a deep curvature, and the curvature is really at the base of the blade. So as we look at these, you'll notice like they go whoop, way over, right? And so this first one we'll start with. This is one of John's swords. It's fantastic. It is a very, very old sword. Maybe Heian, 1150, 1200, maybe early Kamakura periods. Heian period is about say 11, 1200. How some use these terms. Kamakura period is like 1200 to 1300. I'm just kind of being rough. Then Bakucho period we'll call 1300 to 1400. Muromachi period, 1400 to 1600. Edo period, 1600 to 1870s. Well, you'll hear me use those terms a little bit. But let's start here. And this is John's sword. And it is a very old sword. And you'll see it has a great curvature, a very distinct curvature, very pronounced. It's extremely curved. And you'll also notice it's very long, right? These old swords, when they made them, were 30, 32 inches in blade length. Really long swords with great curvature. And a lot of times, they often tapered into a very small tip. The tip is called the kisaki, as many of you know. A kokisaki, a small tip, right? And the tip will come into play a little bit, but a very small tip, a very great curvature. And so if you'll notice, a lot of the curvature, though, is at the base here of the blade. So this sword, very old, 1150, 1200. Heian, late Heian, early Kamakura period. By the Hoju school.
Mhm.
And as you look at it, it has a beautiful hada. You can see. Going on in time, the shape changes a little bit. As you get into Kamakura period, the length reduces a little bit. But also, some of the swords I have shared here, you'll notice that, like, so John's sword is probably ubu, meaning it's been unshortened. Like, that's probably its original length. Some of the swords I'm going to show you have been shortened. And they were shortened primarily in the 1500s. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what you're seeing is not the original length, right? And we'll get to one. But what I want to point out is that in Kamakura period, the length came down a little bit. You have it on the flyer, right? The length's come down a little bit, but still the swords are, for the most part, deep curvature, small kisaki, used from horseback. And so this sword is from early Kamakura, another one of John's swords. You'll see it's a little bit shorter. You'll see it still has a deep curvature at the base, and it has a small kokisaki. Moving on, I'll share a sword from mid-Kamakura, about 1250-ish. And this sword, this is what I wanted to share, is that this sword is shorter, but this is not the original length. This sword was probably, came down to about here, but it was shortened at some point in time to make it even shorter, right? It's a little bit shorter, but again, the highlight is that it has a deep curvature, small kisaki. That's it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is that in the category of Kodachi or is that Wagasashi?
Actually, it's katana length. So, but the truth is, these old swords, the first swords they were made as tachi. And so tachi, when you wore a tachi, you wore it edge down. And when you drew it, you would draw the sword and then you would strike. That's important because in a minute we'll introduce the uchi katana, and the katana, basically katana, which, as you practitioners know, is worn edge up. Because if something's worn edge up, you can draw and strike at the same time. When you were dealing with people from horseback, you didn't need the speed of that draw. So all of these old swords were initially made as tachi. This sword, as short as it is, was meant to be worn edge down. But it was probably came down to about here. So it's still a tachi. But to your point, at this point in time, Kamakura period, they were making shorter blades that were called kodachi. I can't give you the exact measurements of a kodachi, but they're shorter. But maybe they're not like they're not like what we think of as wakizashi from 1600s. They weren't worn as like a daisho per se. Daisho really did come into play until 1600s. We'll talk about that. But they were shorter swords for some reason, which I might not be able to give you. But this sword is katana length. So it was a tachi that was shortened probably in the 1500s to katana length so that it could be worn and used edge up. I wish I had a kodachi. They're very rare. They're very valuable. I don't have a kodachi. So that sword, mid to late Kamakura, 1250-ish. The next sword we have, so as you're kind of as you're moving forward in time, the length starts coming down, but still a tachi, deep curvature, small kokisaki. But then swords do start straightening a little bit and losing a little bit of the curvature. They still have this deep curvature, but through the upper part of the blade, they're pretty straight. And so this next sword is from late Kamakura period. It's from about 1300. And it was a really long sword. You'll notice it has several different holes in the tang. At one point, the sword was like this. And you'll notice now it's pretty straight. But it's straight primarily by virtue of the shortening. When it was made, it was probably like this. Like the curvature started about here, and it was just straight through the rest of the blade. It was a very long sword. It's just been shortened over time. After the shortening, what's left is a pretty straight blade. But the defining feature on it, though, is that it has a small kokisaki. Usually a small kokisaki is a pretty good sign when you're dealing with a very old sword. Yes?
So what's the ultimate function of the curve versus a straight blade?
That's a good question. So I'll answer it this way. Two parts of the answer. So I'm a little bit less knowledgeable in cutting efficacy of a curved blade. Right? I would imagine a curved blade, and correct me when I get it wrong, curved blade probably good it's better for slicing. And these are single edge weapons, so they're more for slicing. We'll get to it in a minute. The 1600s, though, they start interacting with Westerners. Westerners have rapiers. Like Portuguese Westerners, they start interacting with the Portuguese and trading with them. They have rapiers. So in the 1600s, they start making really single-edged blades, but they're really straight. By intention, they're straight. Because they saw the rapiers were more like the Western style of sword fighting was stabbing. The Japanese style was slicing. And so what they were trying to do is make a sword that could slice, which kind of is for like a curved weapon, with a straight blade that could stab too. And so I would say the curved blade primarily to enhance the slicing ability, correct me when I get it wrong, but also, I think it also comes out of the manufacture process. So when they heat treat the blade bends, right? And so if you're gonna make a straight blade, you have to overcorrect for that. So my suspicion is that they were playing with this stuff and they made some swords, they came out and they were like, at first they made these curved blades and were like, oh, you screwed it up, maybe. But they started using them and they were like, that's better than the straight swords. Like if you go back to Kofu period, about 700, the first tempered blades were very, very straight. And then between 700 and like 900 and 1000, all of a sudden the curved blades come into vogue. I imagine they were experimenting, they discovered that curved blades are better for cutting. But I don't have, I'm not a practitioner, so I might default to people that do
straight
practice.
blades have a hard time cutting through armor. Obviously, they slice a leather armor. A curved blade, the Japanese discovered this slice better. But I think the rest of the planet already had that figured out. Even the Middle Easterns had scimitars. Japanese being isolated kind of had to learn the hard way.
Yes.
As everything came from China, they were using Chinese straight blades, so they discovered this isn't hacking into the armor. Yeah.
Yep, agreed.
From a mechanical point of view, a curved blade transforms a cleave into a slice. So imagine this is a round target, and if it's coming this way, it enters like this. But a curved blade would enter like this, and so it has a slicing motion just automatically. And so this really cool special on NHK, which has Ichi Masao, who is like, or Machi Isao, who is he's one of the fastest swordsmen in the world. They actually have showed him cutting plastic pellets being shot at him. But he did this demonstration, and they do show a graphic of how a straight blade and a curved blade differ in terms of their slicing efficacy.
Machiya Sao, the guy who owes you 2 swords?
Yes,
So
he's in Japan.
the
Hard.
ninja were typically in opposition with samurai, right?
So there's Ninja the story and Ninja the reality. And in all honesty, I'm not very knowledgeable about Ninja the reality. I know Ninja the story. Which is
Scott
pretty
knows
cool.
all about ninja.
They didn't use straight swords, so that's a whole American movie.
Yeah.
All swords in Japan were straight, all of them. So they discovered the curved blades were better, and nobody wanted the old crap. If you're gonna ninja, you're gonna hide it in a cane. if you walked around with a sword that told everybody what you were, you'd probably get cut down.
Some swords I've seen that are kind of considered as ninja. We'll have a katana koshirai with a little wakizashi in it because it's deceptive. So whenever you see a sword that has something deceptive about it, maybe it's sort of ninja related, but maybe a ninja also use different tools. Like a sword is a big wieldy thing. If you're bouncing around on buildings trying to be stealthy, like, I don't know, lugging around a long sword might not be the best option. You might use knives, but I'm not very knowledgeable on Ninja, the reality. Ninja the movie though,
Assassin's Creed.
So, I will move us on a little bit. We're gonna skip now to a new epoch. So we talked about Heian and Kamakura. What's important to take away is long curved swords used from horseback. So what happened is the mid-1300s though, early mid-1300s, Japan was invaded by the Mongols. That's a big deal. It's actually one of the first times the Japanese actually worked together as a country to fight off someone. And all these warring, internecine, factionalized warring, and civil wars they always had, all of a sudden there was an outside invader, they actually worked together to fight someone else. But the Mongols had this thick leather armor, and the curved blades with the small tips didn't cut it, pun intended. Like, they just could not deal with that armor. And so all of a sudden, they had to change and adapt to the new reality that they were fighting. And so that enters the Nembukcho period, 1300s, they're fighting Mongol invaders, they're preparing for Mongol invaders, it's happened twice. So they start making different swords. What happens is they start making, on the sheet, they start making longer swords that are actually straighter, wider, thicker, and characterized by a really big tip called an okisaki, large tip. And so, but that's and they were again adapting to who they were fighting. And that was to primarily deal with thick, hide-based armor that the Mongol invaders carried. So this sword, this is a Nembukcho Tachi. Again, this time they're wearing swords still edged down, so it's Tachi. But it comes from the Nembukcho area, about 1380s. And what's characterizes it is that you'll see it's straighter. It's been something that's also tricky is old swords have been modified. They've either been shortened perhaps, they've also been polished down. And so this sword is swords that are very old are kind of narrower than what they were when they were first made. But still you can see it has what I would call a wide mihaba, so a little bit more of a width. But primarily what's important here is the kisaki. Has a much larger tip in comparison to the small tip, right? So that's clearly something that's very important in that style of fighting. The little tips were probably getting broken off left and right. So they need bigger tips to deal with the leather armor of the Mongols. So that's the sword from Nembukcho period, 1380 or so. The big tip. We're going to see the big tip a couple times. So after the 1300s, I wish I had more Nembukcho period swords. It's kind of a rare thing. They're really desirable because everyone likes the okisaki. It's sort of an attractive aspect of these swords. After they were done with the Mongols, right? The Kamikaze, the Divine Wind, the maybe I might have. I'm sorry, I might have misspoke a little bit, but when the Mongols were defeated by the weather, in addition to the Japanese, I think that's reference to the Divine Wind. I might have got it wrong. After the Mongols were gone, they went back to fighting each other, and so now I'm going to introduce sort of an important concept in studying Japanese swords. They were really good at copying what came before them, like. The stuff from the 1200s and 1300s, that was all new. After that, from here on out, for the most part, they're copying what came earlier. And so after the Mongols left, they got back to fighting each other. For the early part of the 1400s, it was pitched battle from horses. So they went back to doing what they do, they made tachi. And so now we have a sword from 08 period, early 1400s. This is one of John's swords, it's beautiful. And you'll see, it is very reminiscent of what we were looking at from the 1200s. You're now 200 years later, and they're making long curved swords that end in a small tip. But what's a little bit different about swords, the tachi that were made later, is that the curvature starts to move up. Instead of from the curvature being here and going this way, the curvature starts to move up the blade. And this blade has a great curvature. But if you compare it to some of the earlier blades, you'll see that the curvature starts to move up. And that's how we know it was a sword probably like 08 period, about 1400. And so they were copying the older swords, but they didn't copy it exactly the same. The curvature moved a little bit. But still, a tachi.
My sword, but I got it from Matt.
That is beautiful. It is beautiful. The next sword I'll share, it too is another tachi. It moves forward a little bit in time. maybe like say early 1460s, let's say, maybe 1500s. A little bit of a debate, and I'll get to why. But it's a long sword, and this too is another tachi. And what's interesting about this tachi is you'll see it has the length and the shape, but this sword is an exact copy of the sword is made by Bungo Sadahiro, worked late 1400s, early 1500s. So maybe the sword is a little bit maybe early 1500s, but it's signed, it's ubu unshortened, but he made this sword as an exact copy of a sword he had access to, which was a sword by Bungo Yukihira. Bungo Yukihira is a very famous swordsmith from about 1150 to 1200. He had access to one of those, and so he copied it exactly. So again, I want to introduce this theme of them copying what came before, but this is what the sword that was made in the 1200s looked like. So I can't afford that sword. It's in a museum anyway, but this is a copy of it. So you can get a sense of what that sword probably looked like. But it's his copy of a much older sword. This sword was made 1500s, copying a sword from about 1200s.
If I could interject, the Slender Tachi is also signed has a Yukihira signature, but it's actually a fake signature. So sometimes the signatures are not very accurate. You can't say, oh, it's definitely made by the smith.
Agreed. Agreed. Yukihira was a famous swordsmith, very famous. So we're now like into the 1400s, and then they have a big blow up. And again, another epoch change. So we had horseback warfare, Mongols, civil wars, but now their civil wars just blow up into violence. They have a period of great violence. It starts with the Onin War in 1467, and the violence really doesn't stop until about 1600. They have a very long set of civil wars, but in the 1467 Onin War, it's mostly concentrated in Kyoto, and in Kyoto, basically the whole city is raised almost from the intense fighting that was going on. But this is when there was a step change that I think you'll all be pretty familiar with. This is when, at that point in time, the combat was close up and personal. It was close quarters combat in the city, fighting each other man to man. And what they realized was, hey, if I've got a tachi from 1400 and I draw it and then I swing, it takes 2 movements. If I flip it up this way, I can draw and strike at the same time. And in a sword fight, as I understand, the first person that gets hit is probably going to lose. So if you can hit quicker, speed wins. And so length, maybe I can reach you from a further distance. But if I have speed and we're up close, I win. So all of a sudden there was this great demand for shorter swords, because these long swords, even if you wear them up, you got long, this huge motion. Short sword, it's quick. And so they're fighting close up and personal. The shape changes again. And now they favor short swords. And one thing they did, they took all the long swords, they started lopping off the ends of them to make them shorter, to make them functional weapons. A sword, there's an art to it. We enjoy the art of it, but the truth is the weapons first. And for practical weapons purposes, they started truncating swords to make them effective for this period of close-up combat. So swords from, say, 1470 to, say, 1580, and there's they change a little bit, but the swords generally got shorter over that time frame. So I have an interesting sword here to share. This sword was made about 1500. It's also what I would call a katana ichi. So it was intended for use as a one-handed weapon, right? All these swords, 2 hands. This sword was intended for one-handed use. One hand, draw, strike. But you'll see it's shorter, more compact, and it still has a healthy curvature. So this sword is made by swordsmith Katsumitsu about 1500. There's also something interesting about this sword, is that I'm going to share the Nakago. I don't realize how far away we can look at it. So swordsmith signed his name on the Nakago. Michiro Katsumitsu, 1500, katana uchi. Has a really vibrant hamon, so when you walk by and see it, you'll see the hamon. But it also has this on the back. I don't know if you can see it, but it's this gold signature. The gold signature is a cutting test. So we'll fast forward briefly to the 1600s. So 1600s, there wasn't as much warfare, and samurai were really rich. So samurai would have their swords tested to understand how good they could perform. And so this sword has a cut test dated 1671. I think roughly 1671. And what they did for cut tests is they would take, samurai would give their swords to executioners. Executioners would kill criminals. This is brutal, but it is what it is. They would stack dead bodies at the execution grounds, and they would cut through them in different parts to see how many bodies the sword could cut through with one swing. And that would be the results of the test. And they would inscribe the results of the test on the Nakago. So this is a blade made 1500 that was cut tested in 1670s. It cut through, I think, about 2 bodies, one-handed swing. So kind of a
Only two.
only two, not much hard.
Get the rookie numbers up.
Yeah. So then we get to one more sword from Muromachi period. This sword, I'll kind of hit it quickly, about 1550. And what I would point out is that compared to the swords that came earlier, you'll see it's shorter. This is what I would call uchigatana. So it's the predecessor of a katana. It was the uchigatana, and they made these swords 1500s specifically to be used edge up and drawn in kind of a quick draw fashion. So it's uchigatana, and made about 1550. And you'll see it has a little bit of curvature. The curvature has changed, the stiff has changed, but primarily the length has changed. All right, now we're getting there. I don't want to lose you yet. I'll move a little bit quicker. But kotos, I mean, old swords, koto, pre-1600, more rare, more desirable. Now we're going to get into, again, another step change. We're going to enter the 1600s. So by the 1600s, there was peace in Japan finally. So the Tokugawa, like after the period of civil wars ended, with Oda Nobunaga starting to coalesce, and then Toyotomi Hideyoshi succeeded him. They really started unifying Japan, but he didn't really live to see the final, like, enjoy the spoils of the war. And then Tokugawa Ieyasu, thank you. I have a story about Ieyasu. Ieyasu. So Tokugawa Ieyasu was the final guy that sort of unifies Japan, and his family and his progeny basically ruled Japan as the shogunate for 200 plus years. But it ushers in this era of peace. And in this era of peace, there are no more fights. But the samurai have a lot of power, and they're quite wealthy. And so there's not really a need, there's no war, so there's not really a high demand for swords by virtue of war, but now there's this high demand for swords as a virtue of art. The samurai are very wealthy, powerful, and they start commissioning these fantastic art swords to be made by these swordsmiths that now they're cutting weapons, but now there's this emphasis on the art of the sword. And so swords from 1600s are usually very flashy, but maybe not quite as practical as weapons. Second thing that happens in the 1600s is they start interacting with Westerners. As mentioned earlier, the Westerners have straight swords for stabbing, and they start copying that. So what happens in the 1600s is all of a sudden the swords start losing curvature, and they become very straight. I'm going to show you 3 swords from the 1600s from this period. Edo period, the 1600s, we also refer to as Shinto. The first one is a sword from maybe late 1500s, 1590, maybe 1610. Early Shinto, early 1600s, but you'll see on this sword, it's very straight. It's starting to lose the curvature, and that's because they're borrowing technology from the Westerners, or trying to emulate it. Another thing I'll point out, again, the spirit of them copying, this theme of them copying what came earlier, this sword has a longer kisaki. The armor started getting much tougher, because also, I should say this, so the Civil Wars ended when they figured out how to master the matchlock. The matchlock became a really important part of the warfare. Whoever had matchlocks and could wield them won, right? So Oda Nobunaga, I think Battle of Nagashino, was first to really sort of use musketry. And musketry, all of a sudden, they changed the armor to battle the muskets. So the armor got thicker and more metal. And so what did they learn from way back with thicker armor? You needed a big tip. So they brought back the big tip. So straighter sword, big tip, early 1600s. We get into, so the next sword I would call is truly what I would say is an art sword, meaning that it's a functional weapon, but probably was never used very much. It was made by a really famous swordsmith, Inoue Shinkai. It's one of his early swords. But the swords he made were more art than weapon, on a certain sense. But this sword is from mid to late 1600s, 1670s, and again you'll see it's primarily straight. It's starting to lose the curvature of what came before. And then the final sword from the 1600s that I'll show you, you'll see, is basically straight as a toothpick. No, it's not toothpick, but it's just straight. It's huge sword. So they were making swords, custom order swords. They made really large swords. And these are swords, these were long swords too at some point in time, and they were short. Now we have swords from the 1600s. There was no warfare. There was not as much shortening. So we have swords now that are original length. You'll see this is a really large sword from 1680s. And you'll see, though, that it's very straight. There's almost no curvature. So the 1600s are this period of time where the curvature disappears. All right. Also in the 1600s is the concept of, I'm sure maybe some of you have heard of a daisho. So I left a sword at home. I was going to hit on this topic a little earlier, but I left a sword at home. That's on me. So in the 1600s, samurai were mostly walking in the streets, telling people what to do. They were required to carry two swords: a dai, which is the long sword, and the sho, which is the short sword. So in the 1600s, all of a sudden, there's this need for short swords, so they start making the wakizashi. And now, yes, they made short swords earlier. They made kodachi, they made katana-buchi, but the wakizashi, as we mostly know it, came into vogue in the 1600s to be worn as a sidearm as part of a daisho. So I have wakizashi. This is from the 1600s. You'll notice it's a shorter sword. The blade length is between 12 and 24 inches. What's important about it is, again, like in this theme of the shape of samurai swords, like I want to make sure you, like, when you find a sword, like you can look at a sword by the shape and you can figure out when it was made. So like in general, if you see a short sword, you can feel pretty good it was probably made in the 1600s because they cranked out a bunch of these at that point in time. So wakizashi, primarily a sword from the 1600s. So 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. Now we get into the 1700s, and I only have one lowly little blade from the 1700s. That's because all these wealthy samurai from the 1600s, they spent all the money, and then they died off, and there was no war. And all of a sudden, there was no demand for swords. And swords were also a business. And the sword business cratered. And there's no one buying swords. And swordsmiths started starving. So there's not many swords from the 1700s. It's just sort of a black hole of swordsmithing. But I have a sword from the 1700s. I want to share it. And what's interesting about it is, shape-wise, the interesting thing, it has a little bit more curvature. So they start getting away from some of the straight. They start injecting a little bit more curvature. But if, like, unfortunately, you won't get hold of the sword. When you hold it, it's heavy. It's very heavy. By the 1700s, they started making heavier swords because the armor had gotten so good. They needed more heft in the swords to be able to cut through the armor. So you'll see in swords made 1700s, 1800s, a lot of them are heftier. Like maybe the key, like you'll see in a sword of 1800s, the key shape observation is the width across the mune. Thicker swords, more metal, more heft. Maybe they're not longer, a little more curvature, but they're thicker. So that's also part of the shape, right? Yes, there's curvature, there's length, but there's also the geometry of width, the different aspect parts of the sword. So the swords from the 1700s, kind of a rare thing, so there weren't a lot of swords made then, but it's hefty. Then we get into the 1800s, and in the 1800s, there's this, some 1700s were bad for the sword business, but the 1800s, swords come back into vogue, and they start making swords. This guy, Tsushinshi Masahide, was a famous swordsmith, and he advocated for, what they started doing, the swords were made in the 1600s that were art swords. They started observing that when they used those swords in combat, the edges, when they started, in the 1600s, they made swords with a big hamon, and the hamon is very brittle. It's crystalline steel. So those swords, when used, would chip and crack very easily. They started realizing that the fancy swords that the samurai commissioned in the 1600s were not really good weapons. So in the 1800s, this guy, Tsushinshi Masahide, started advocating to go back to the style of weapons from the 1200s. So they start doing what they do best. They start copying swords from the 1200s. So I have a sword from Tsushinshi Masahide. When he started his career, he was emulating swords from the 1600s before he realized that was a bad idea. He started emulating swords from the 1200s. But this is a copy, actually, of a sword made by Inoue Shinkai. The person that made this sword, 200 years later, or 150 years later, Masahide is copying one of this guy's swords. But again, copying. But this is a nice sword, and as you look at it, one thing it has on it, it's wakizashi, so short sword, but it has, they start also, they're always embellishing their swords. This sword has a really nice horimono, or carving on it, and at this point in time, they kind of really perfected horimonos. It's a beautiful horimono of a dragon on one side. We're almost done. We're close. The next sword, though, this is from the 1800s, and I want to point this out on this sword is that what's interesting about it, this is made by the son-in-law of Masahide, But this too is a copy. And so Masahide influenced people to copy the old swords from 12 and 1300s. This is a copy of a Nembuk Shotachi. And you'll see it has the long tip, and it's sort of straight. So again, they're copying what was done earlier. And so this is a sword made in the 1800s as a copy of a sword from the 1300s. So when you run across a sword with a big tip, you have to consider, was it made in the 1800s? Was it made in the late 1500s or early 1600s? Or was it made in the 1300s? So the shape of a sword is the first thing you look at because it tells you when something was made, right? But it can be a little tricky because they were copying along the way. But yeah, that's really the main theme is we look at the shape of the sword first because it tells us when it was made. And it's like the first thing you want to understand about a sword. You look at the length, the curvature, and it tells you, based on what we understand about how the shape evolved over time, the curvature tells you when the sword was made. It's the first way you can look at the sword and start figuring out what it is without having to do much study on it. Two more swords, and I'll be done. This is a sword from the 1800s. I brought it just because it's really wide and thick. Again, the shape, I want to point out the shape is not just curvature and length. Shape is also geometry, width across the mune, and that's important because this is a very wide sword. It's very thick, it's very heavy, it's very hefty. And that's because it needs to cut through thick armor by the 1800s. And then finally, I want to introduce one more sword, and that's a sword from World War II. So, the samurai lost power in 1870, 1868. All of a sudden, there was no demand for swords. And the Japanese made swords like Americans make guns. They had tons of them. The country was littered with swords. So all of a sudden, demand for swords just craters. You can buy swords a dime a dozen, right? The Imperial Japanese Army are using Western-style military tactics, Western-style weapons, guns, cannons, so they don't really need swords. Samurai lost power. The cult of the sword starts to diminish. But what happens is the Imperial Japan starts expanding, and they get into bigger scrapes, right? That scrape with Russia in the early 1900s, and they get into a scrape with the US, the rest of the world in the 1930s and 40s. And so all of a sudden, they have a huge demand to build a massive army. As part of their army, they tell the officers they have to carry a samurai sword as a sidearm. So officers are lugging swords through the jungle. But this creates a huge demand for swords. And so the 1930s and 40s see this massive rebirth in swordsmithing. And in fact, anytime they had to make a lot of swords, usually the quality of the swords goes down because they were mass producing to meet the demand. And even in the 1930s and 40s, they protected this art of the samurai sword. In the 1930s and 40s, there were swordsmiths that were making extremely high quality swords in the same traditional way as the rest of these swords, continuing this art, this tradition that had gone on for 1,000 years. So this is a sword by a really famous World War II era swordsmith, Kuniie. Swords from the 1930s and 40s shape-wise, what's interesting about it is for the most part, they all have a uniform shape because they were going in the mounts that we introduced earlier, they were all the same mount. So World War II era swords generally all have a similar length of about 26¼ inches. They all have a similar curvature because they're all going in uniform mounts. And so that's what's interesting about the shape of swords from the 30s and 40s is it's very uniform. So if you see one sword from the 30s and 40s, you kind of see them all from the shape perspective. But what's interesting about this sword, if you look at it, is the workmanship. It has a really fine hamon. You can see it even in these slides. You can see it. You can see how about this? You can see it even without handling it. It has a beautiful hamon, and he was a very high quality craftsman from the 30s and 40s. So we've covered 800 years of swords, and the main thing I want to impart is two or three main things. First, the shape of the sword tells us the age. And so if you can know the shape and look at it and understand who they were fighting and why they were fighting, you don't have to look at the tang to see who made it to know how old it is. And that's one thing. The other is that it's important to know they were constantly copying what came before. That's kind of a common thing. So that's what I've got for you all today. Thank you very much for hearing me out. Any questions you might have? After questions, I want to give everyone a chance to kind of come through here and look. And again, as you look, probably not good to touch today, but if you want to touch the swords and handle them, contact me, and we'll set up time. And but feel free to take a look, ask questions, and I'm happy to help. Yes.
Just curious, so from the World War II era swords, would you say nationalism is part of what drove some of the production?
Do any people here have any
So what was
questions? Do you have any questions?
So
I can
during
forward
the
them.
World War II era,
Yes.
would you say that nationalism is part of what drove production of some of these swords?
Yes, and I would say
You know, trying to get that national identity of the.
absolutely. Like I don't know what it's like to lug around. I don't know what the jungles of the Pacific must be like. But as a place for warfare, the combat was brutal, the location was brutal. But if you think about their officers were lugging these swords around, like they're carrying armaments too, and they're in intense fights with Western's forces.
Not the
And
first
they
time
were
I've
winning.
for either.
So they had these swords they were lugging around through the jungle. So it was a real. It had to have been a pain in the ass. And but they
Got the
still
question.
loved it. And to me, it's like, and and this is important and it's brutal, but they also used them. They weren't.
Coding
It wasn't
about
symbolic, it was
150
symbolic
to
of
200.
but they were also functional weapons, and they were used. And we see weapons, we see swords sometimes that have bullet holes in them, and you can see by the placement of the bullets they were shot at when they were some kind of a charge. They were used. But again, it's somewhat impractical to lug around a sword through a jungle. And but yeah, they have
Traditionally
they had
3 to 6
intense
months.
pride. In fact, the leadership of the military leaders of Japan were heavily involved with the sword making community. So, for instance, there was one famous swordsmith from World War II era. His name was Kurihara Akihide. He was also a politician, and so some powerful people revived the swordsmithing and sort of influenced other powerful people in the military to require, like there's also business here. Like once they had to require officers to carry swords, all of a sudden they had to make a bunch of swords, big business. Like military contract, right? Military industrial complex.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Somebody asks from TikTok, do you have any Geo token here?
Do I have Geo token here? I do not. I did not bring any Geo token.
That Horimono isn't Geo token?
What's that?
That Horimono one isn't Geo token?
No, it's Wakizashi. Typically, I'm going to give you some loose rules based on my understanding, but probably Wakizashi from Shinshinto Wakizashi might not be eligible for Geo token.
Yeah, I forget about
I
that.
mean, if you have a Kiyomaro, maybe, so maybe I think a general rule would be Shinto Wakizashi might not be eligible. The Shinkai is probably a little short. Like my understanding is at the moment, if you have a Shinkai, an early Shinkai, 28 inches or more, might be a good contender. But Juyo process is like a competitive process. So Juyo Shinsa is a Shinsa at the MBTHK Sword Museum. They have once a year. And it's a status the sword can receive that sort of elevates it above others. And it's a competitive process. People submit swords and they get judged. And then the best swords of the year are kind of picked and they're issued some paperwork. And so having a Geo level sword is kind of an important thing. But they're really picky, obviously, about what they pass as Geo. I would say there are no Geo swords here, but there might be Geo contenders. They just haven't been restored. They haven't been submitted. Maybe they need a little bit of this, a little bit of that. John's Hoju blade,
I'm pretty sure that was probably submitted at one time or another.
but that sword, but a little bit, could be like a Geo contender because it's so old, it's so rare, it's in great condition. But no Geo blades here at this one. That's maybe next time if I get invited back.
Of course. Well, go ahead.
I just wanted to add 2 things.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people think just because it's old, it's worth a lot. They don't realize in the 13, 14, 1500s, a lot of Smiths mass-produced swords. They didn't sign their name on it because it was a samurai got a brand new sword every battle.
Yes.
Every battle they would get a brand new blade. So when it was made and where it was made, but they wouldn't put their name on it because it was mass-produced. And the second thing I wanted to add is in the Ghost of Tsushima, katana wasn't even invented yet. So in the popular video games Ghost of Tsushima, they weren't even using katana or uchi katana. It would have been tachi. But it's interesting how popular media has misinterpreted that historical element. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, well, first, like they're fascinating. It's I used to play Final Fantasy a lot. I was a big Final Fantasy player a long time ago, and of course, I always wanted a Masamune, right? And Masamune is a very famous swordsmith, Muramasa. But like, I didn't understand until later what all the rest of the sword. I knew Masamune, I knew Muramasa, but I did not know Raikuni Mitsu, right? I've learned about Raikuni Mitsu because of studying swords a little bit, but I get it's pretty, and also Tsuji Masahide or Shikai, right? So it's pretty cool that some of these names, like they took swordsmith names and they had swords in the game named after these swordsmiths, but it flew over my head until I got into this. But one thing that you said that I'll mention, it's important. whenever there was a lot of fighting, and there was a huge demand for swords, the quality of manufacture went down because they needed to churn stuff out. In the 1500s, for instance, these old swords of the 1500s, that's when the fighting was most intense in their civil wars. They churned out tons of stuff. So a lot of the swords of the 1500s are often sort of looked down on because they were generally mass produced. But, so there's some unfair aspects of the collecting, but probably less unfair on the practitioner. I think that swords of the 1500s, which were made more as weapons, probably pretty effective. And that when we get to the 1600s, we're art sword enthusiasts, we care what it looks like, not how it works. Yeah, we look down on the stuff in the 1500s, but if I could pick a sword, there are a few swords that I've handled over time. If I were needed a sword to use, and I'm not a practitioner yet, but if I were to pick a sword that I would use, there was one from the 1500s that Vicendos, a Quesada, who made a bunch of swords. There was one though, it was just a strong sword, big, wide, heavy sword, nice length, beautiful curvature, mass produced, but I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of it. It's one of the strongest swords I've seen. And I was like, that's what I would want. That was great. What other questions?
The groove that goes along the edge on the side of it, is that just ornamental, and did that change by the eras?
Great question. So the
Steve,
groove
we
is
talked about it
called,
earlier. He's
bogie.
pro Takata.
And there's different styles of bogie. There's a whole subset of bogie. But the
Lunchbox
grooves
Jones,
are used
yes.
for a couple things. And it's a great question because if we go way back, these swords that were older, old koto, you'll notice when you're handling them, they're generally lighter. Right? Remember, they weren't dealing with, when they made these swords, they weren't dealing with the heavy armor of the Mongols, the heavy armor needed for musket defense, right? So old swords are usually lighter. And so to swing faster, right? So they wanted to make them even lighter, they would shave off some of the material. Well, you didn't want to shave off, like in the geometry of a sword, right? And this is a good example because it has bohi, the big deep groove, and it has soihi, which is the narrow groove beneath it. So this sword has like two levels of grooves. If you're making grooves though, like the geometry of the sword, right? You have the shinogi, and then I call it the G, right? But the shinogi G is that primary ridge line that runs up the length of the blade. Shinogi is this part, right? That curves back this way, and then it's easier if we're handling it. But G this way. And so if you're carving stuff out, now they carved on the G later whenever they wanted to for decorative purposes, but if you're trying to remove material, probably this is the less functional part. So they carved the grooves generally in the shinogi G to remove material, and it made the blades lighter. So that was really important with old swords. So a lot of times when you see bogi, usually it's for, so like if you come over here, like of these old swords, 1, 2, 3, like of Kamakura, like half of them have grooves. When you come down here to Shinshinto, only a couple. That's because the grooves, maybe the point of the groove starts changing. Originally it's to remove material, make it lighter. But, I mean, I don't know. This sword was huge, right? Maybe they made the groove, they knew they were making a big sword. They wanted to reduce the weight a little bit, so they made the groove. But I also think that it was also somewhat decorative. And that's a little bit personal opinion, because sometimes, I mean, maybe I shouldn't go too far in saying that, but like, in the 1600s, they start making more decorative types of swords. And like when you look at the Masahita, you'll see like, man, it's heavily decorated. So decoration was also an intent when they made these things. To some people, the groove is attractive. It's an attractive element. It makes it a little bit more beautiful, perhaps. So there was a functional reason. I also would think there's a decorative reason. What other questions from the team?
My daughter and I are going to Japan next summer, and
Awesome.
Are there areas that were like more like heavier battlefields and like heavier in numbers, where we would possibly find some memorabilia or?
Well, dotted across Japan are several different options for seeing swords in hand and studying them. There's many sword dealers. Actually, all the best swords are in Japan. There's many opportunities. If you want to look at swords and study samurai artifacts, you have first museums. You have like in Tokyo, the National Museum. but I would highly recommend the MBTHK Sword Museum, which is like the best place to go and view swords probably. There's there are many museums dotted across Japan that are filled with really high quality swords, really impressive and really famous swords. So museums would be one option. Another option would be to go to sword shops. There are very many sword shops. You can go in sword shops, and if you can, if you adhere to a few guidelines before you go, like call ahead, schedule in advance, maybe buy something, right? They will bring out stuff, and you can handle it and study it in hand. Like in-hand study, that's one of the cool things about this hobby is there is a lot of in-hand study and stuff, right? Like you can study, like, you go to a museum, you can't touch anything, but if you're dealing with sword dealers, you can usually touch the stuff. So you go to sword shops, you go to armor shops, but as far as the battlefields, you can also go like flea markets, and you can find all kinds of parts and pieces in flea markets. So there's options and places you can go to find sword-related items and swords. I'm a little bit less knowledgeable on the battlefields.
Kawa Nakajima has a really nice, yeah. But Tokugawa Art Museum is probably my favorite. Tokugawa Art Museum is done because they have horse armor.
Yeah,
Like
yep.
all the things, yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. Very cool. Any other questions? I realize we have the quick time check. We've gone for about almost an hour and a half. Y'all hung out here a long time. You've listened to me battle on and ramble for a long time. I'm grateful for that.
It's really great.
Hey, happy to answer any more questions, but also want to give everyone a chance to how about this? I'll hang out over here. I'll answer any more questions you have. We can chit chat, talk swords forever. But I also want to make sure everyone gets a chance to come through and look at swords and get a sense for what I've been rambling on for a while now. But I'm very grateful and thank you for having me.
On behalf of our make it kind of
This way, let's start here. Maybe I'll move this a little
Yeah.
bit.
Remember, be wary of the tips. Don't stab yourself. And try not to breathe on the blades, literally. I'm not joking. And then please don't touch the blades.
Thank you guys.
Don't even look at them funny.
Don't even look at them funny. All right, thank you all for joining in. We're going to go ahead and shut this down for now. We'll be back live. We actually have a Cloudhammer shipment that came in.
I would say really
Small one.
Go through and,
Actually, big ones.
Koshrai, Koto,